Hello, we are ready for Module 3, which is Effective Feedback for Student Learning. In the last module, we talked about creating student choice and student-led options in our assessments, building in those scaffoldings for those different tiers of learners. And this time this module, we're going to talk about how we can use our time effectively in giving feedback to students when that happens in the process and keeping that student learning, what we want the outcome of that final summative assessment to look like, and what we can do along the way in terms of our role as coach and guide on the side. So let's go ahead and jump into the objectives for this module. If you're watching this video, you're already there. We're going to, of course, go over the why, what, and how of feedback this week. In this module. So first of all, we're going to explore, first of all, why. Why does feedback matter? And I think we kind of know as learners how important feedback is to us. And in fact, perhaps one of the downsides of a course like this that's sort of loose and open is that you're not getting that feedback along the way. You're doing things, but you're not really sure. It's kind of out there. The very first online class I ever took was actually just an independent study that had no LMS housing it. It was literally a professor emailing me things, and then I would email her back answers, and there would be this long lag, never get a response, and at the end of the course I got an A. And I think it was perhaps then that I realized how important feedback was to me as a learner. So let's look at the research that shows us why feedback is something that we need to consider. Then it says students that you will research what technology tools are available. You can see me rely a lot on technology for this what part. And the rationale here again is that it's very difficult to really create assessments for all students that that individualize and create this real world type authenticity and problem solving approach without involving some integration. I think that this just really goes well with hand in hand with blended learning. It's hard to do one without the other. And I would argue that blended learning is not as effective if it's not powered by this rethinking of assessments. So all of that to say, we're going to look at some tools that can allow us to be effective with our feedback and also still have time to be a person. One of my favorite education stories was having taught a number of years and had a couple kids and had been in a school system for a little while, so my students knew me well. And one of the kids raised his hand and said, "Mrs. Schrock, when are you going to get our papers back?" And another kid without missing a beat, another kid in the back of the room says, "She has a life, you know." And I laughed because sometimes we don't feel like we have a life, right? But I've learned through education, and many of you probably have done the same, that if I don't retool and refuel at some point, I just get burnt out. So what tools are out there that help us to do the ideal in giving students effective feedback and still make room for the rest of our lives, because we have a life, and then we're going to look at how. We're going to look at these ideas and this research, and we're going to put it together in our how. Our how is what our feedback plan is going to be. And you notice it says during the learning process, not just at the end, because we all know as we research, we're going to see that looking at formative assessment as our times for feedback instead of just waiting for that last big paper and our last big POW. I'll never forget watching students take my hours of work of giving them feedback on papers and throwing it away because I had no plan. My plan was for them to receive the paper and absorb my comments, and it doesn't work that way. They need to know there's something. To them, it was the end of the conversation. Conversation over, decision made, paper thrown away. So what are we going to do to reshape the conversation aspect of assessment? So we're going to have just 3 items this week. You notice it's kind of narrowing in a little bit. We have an interactive rubrics tool here that's pretty cool. This is where you're going to get a lot of tech ideas as well. Here's another same source, different person. This source is Edutopia is a real big clearinghouse for education. And if you haven't subscribed to it, you might want to do that. Looking again at formative assessment and the importance of feedback along the way. And then there is, I'm going to use this coming up here real shortly. I'm really excited. I actually mentioned this in my last video where I said my students, instead of creating a research paper, are going to create a gallery walk or an display of learning, and using gallery walks to give and receive peer feedback was what inspired that concept for me. So hopefully you can look at those. These are not meant to be all encompassing everything you ever needed to know, but it's supposed to be something just to kind of whet your appetite and rethinking how you might give feedback for your newly fashioned assessment concepts. That's all I've got for you today, except to quickly go over the assignment. I almost forgot. There are 3 things I'd like you to do this time. I want you to think in terms of your feedback to students. That's just part of the puzzle. Then peer feedback, because we all know that sometimes this can go way wrong, and I've seen some ugly articles who paint it ugly and say this is just a platform for student bullying. How are you going to create structures to make this effective? And then finally, how are we going to teach our students to be reflective about their own learning? And that's part of feedback. So you're going to create something for you to give feedback through their process, something for peers, and then something for self-reflection. And define how and when these are going to be used. And it might look different. Like my feedback for a formative instruction might look slightly different than my final instruction. One of my big aha moments in education came when I co-taught a science fair project with the science department. And the teacher and I had an understanding, the science end of it had an understanding that I would look over their science fair papers for grammar details, and I would teach the structure, and we had this like really good system, and she would look at content and make sure that all of their variables and things were in the right place, right? So but if I waited till science fair to give them feedback, it didn't help them because their papers weren't corrected for science fair. They had a real authentic audience. They had judges coming in. So I actually ended up giving them feedback along the way, especially on a specific rough draft. And then their final draft was basically, did you make editing attempts? And I tell you what, it was pretty cool because I had students definitely more invested in editing than I've ever really seen, because they had a real audience. There was a reason to edit, and there was a reason to listen to my feedback and try to understand it. But check out the interactive rubric piece for sure as you're building this. Not that you have to create an interactive rubric, but the idea that part of the reason I think that we have bad experiences with peer editing and even student reflection is that we don't always give them the tools they need to help correct one another and themselves. So check out that stuff and enjoy this unit and your learning journey. Talk to you later.